Sister Catherine Ann Cesnik, known as Cathy, was a 26-year-old Roman Catholic nun and high school teacher whose 1969 murder in Baltimore remains unsolved. Her death highlighted systemic issues within the Catholic Church, and it sparked a broader conversation about sexual abuse and institutional cover ups. So, when it comes to Cathy Cesnik, we start with the early life and education. Catherine Ann Cesnik was born on November 17th, 1942, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, during a time when the city was still very much defined by its steel industry, its tight knit working class neighborhoods, and Catholic traditions that permeated family and community life. So, the eldest of four children, Catherine's position in the Cesnik household carried both expectation and responsibility. As the firstborn, she naturally assumed a role of leadership and caretaking toward her younger siblings, a role that would later be mirrored in her teaching style and her vocation as a nun and educator. Her parents raised her in a deeply Catholic environment. Pittsburgh, with its large population of Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants, was heavily influenced by Catholic parishes, schools, and religious orders. And this context provided Catherine not just with faith-based education, but with a cultural identity rooted in service discipline and moral duty. Those formative influences helped shape her worldview, one where faith and responsibility went hand in hand. Catherine attended St. Augustine High School, a Catholic institution that emphasized both academic rigor and spiritual formation. Records and recollections suggest she excelled both intellectually and socially during these years. Catherine quickly distinguished herself as an exceptional student and leader. She graduated as valedictorian, reflecting not only her intelligence, but also her discipline, her work ethic, and ability to balance multiple responsibilities. Her classmates and teachers also recognized her character, charisma, and presence. She was chosen as May Queen, a symbolic role in Catholic schools that celebrated not just beauty, but also grace, morality, and devotion to the Virgin Mary. This honor bestowed by peers and faculty indicates that Catherine was held in high esteem by her community, not merely for her academic accomplishments, but for her personal qualities of kindness, humility, and leadership. Catherine's leadership extended into school governance because she served as president of both the senior class and the student council, positions that required her to be that required her to represent her peers, to organize activities and act as a liaison between the students and the administrators. These roles reinforced her reputation as someone who was not only academically talented, but also capable of guiding others, speaking with authority, and taking on responsibility beyond herself. So, this blend of intellectual capacity, spiritual devotion, and interpersonal skill foreshadowed her later role as a beloved teacher, one who inspired trust and admiration from students. In 1960, upon graduating from St. Augustine High School at the age of 18, Catherine made the profound and life-changing decision to enter the School Sisters of Notre Dame, a Catholic religious order dedicated to education and service. Her decision was consistent with the time period because many Catholic women around this time, particularly high-achieving students, educated in uh, in parochial schools, saw religious life as a noble and respected path. However, it also reflected Catherine's deep sense of purpose and calling. Upon entering the convent, she took the religious name Sister Catherine Ann, a name that symbolized both her new identity and her commitment to the vows of religious life. This choice was not taken lightly. It marked her dedication to chastity, poverty, and obedience, as well as her desire to dedicate her entire life to God and to others through education. The School Sisters of Notre Dame had a strong presence in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States. So their mission, it was rooted in providing education, particularly to young women, and fostering intellectual growth alongside spiritual and moral development. For Catherine, this was the perfect alignment of her talents and her calling. She was an exceptional student who thrived in academics, but she was also a natural leader, a nurturer, and role model. The transition from young student to novice nun required Catherine to undergo a structured program of religious and intellectual formation. And this would have included daily prayer, theological study, community living, and strict adherence to the rhythms of convent life. In the early 1960s, convent training was still traditional and disciplined, though it was on the cusp of the reforms that Vatican II would soon bring. Catherine entered at a time when religious life was respected, it was orderly, and it was highly structured, providing her with both stability and a foundation for her future role as an educator. So her early life and education illustrates several key traits that will define her adult life, with one being academic excellence. Because she went from valedictorian to later teaching achievements, she showed an intellectual discipline that carried through every stage of her life. Second, it's leadership and influence, because her roles in student government and symbolic honors such as May Queen demonstrate her ability to inspire and lead others. Third, religious devotion and service. So choosing to enter the School Sisters of Notre Dame reflected her deep faith and commitment to living a life of purpose. And lastly, it was the personal charisma and her grace. Because beyond the accomplishments, Catherine's character, warmth, and presence earned her recognition and admiration from peers. And we also have her teaching career as well. So Kathy began teaching English literature and drama at the newly opened Archbishop Keough High School in 1965, quickly earning a reputation as a brilliant, energetic, energetic educator beloved by students from working class Irish American neighborhood. So Gemma Hoskins, who later became a celebrated public school teacher and Maryland Teacher of the Year in 1992, she credits Kathy with inspiring her vocation, saying that Catherine Cesnik is the reason I became a teacher, and I still regard her as the finest teacher I ever had. Other students even recalled her as their Pierre the Piper, the kind of teacher that you never forget. And in spring of 1969, it marked the turning point. So former students, they remember Kathy as stressed out, perhaps even on the edge of a nervous breakdown, exhausted and extremely nervous, and notably absent from school at times. So in June 1969, she sought and received permission from her order, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, to take exclaustration, to live outside of the convent, wear civilian clothing, yet remain bound by her religious vows. And this period represented both the personal liberation and intense inner conflict, stepping into the lay life while carrying the weight of her vocation. So Kathy moved into a two-bedroom apartment at the Carriage House on North Bend Road in Catonsville, sharing the space with Sister Helen Russell Phillips, another nun who also stopped wearing the habit and taught at Weston High School, a local public institution. She transitioned to teaching English and drama at Weston High for the 1969-1970 year, labeling herself a missionary teacher, a bold mission reflecting both her passion for education and desire to reach beyond her familiar parish school environment. So, despite this shift, Keough students maintain contact with her still. Some visit her apartment that summer and into the fall. And there was one student that recalled saying, I visited them. And by visiting them, Kathy and Sister Helen there during that summer. So Kathy was remembered for her theatrical engagement in class, drawing students into poetry and drama through vibrant, expressive delivery. As one alum had recounted, she was a dynamic educator who loved poetry and music, also a friend, a mentor, and perhaps most importantly, a confidant. Another memory is during drama rehearsals, she lived her habit to demonstrate dance moves, showing her humility and commitment to connecting with students in tangible ways. And perhaps the most profound aspect of her teaching legacy was her role as a listener and protector. Because in later investigations, survivors of abuse at Keough described how they confided in Sister Cathy, one even recounting she had asked the students, are the priests hurting you? Now, that she held that she held these confidences may have placed her in perilous proximity to institutional secrets and cover-ups, a tragic aspect of her final chapter in life. And what we also do have is here's the disappearance and the murder. So November 7th, 1969. So Kathy Cesnik, a 26-year-old school sister Notre Dame, an English teacher, drama teacher at Archbishop Keough High School, she lived in the Carriage House apartments in the Baltimore area. So on the evening of November 7th, 1969, she left her apartment with the stated purpose of purchasing an engagement gift for her sister. And this is the last day that she was seen alive. And not long after her disappearance, witnesses or passerby located her vehicle illegally parked near the apartment complex. The presence of her car near her home, not the shopping area she had said she was going to, became an early and unexplained detail in the case and was noted in the police reporting and later case summaries. The car's location contributed to immediate concern among her friends and coworkers. And when Kathy did not return that night, she was reported missing the next day. So friends, colleagues, and her religious community, they began checking with the hospitals and the shelters, and investigators opened a missing person investigation. So the initial hours and the days are often critical in missing person cases, and the record shows an immediate local response. So on January 3rd, 1970, Kathy's body was discovered in a remote area near Lansdowne, Maryland, at an informal dump site in wooded area in southwest Baltimore County. Reports from multiple sources they note that a hunter or a person out in the area they found the remains, and the body was in an advanced state of decomposition by the time that it was located. So the coroner's report and contemporaneous reporting identified blunt force trauma to the head, a crushed or fractured skull, as the cause of death. The injury indicated a violent assault rather than an accident, and the extent of decomposition complicated immediate forensic detail. But the skull was clear and central to the determination of homicide. So, what does this immediate physical evidence in this scene tell us exactly? Well, it tells us three things. For one, it's the location and concealment. See, finding the body in a remote dump area suggests the killer or killers transported the victim some distance from where she disappeared and chose a relatively secluded, impromptu dump site rather than a residential or obviously visible location. And that suggests intent to conceal and delay discovery. Secondly, it's the timing and decomposition. See, the body was discovered almost 2 months after her disappearance, and decomposition limited early forensic possibilities, such as fingerprint quality and soft tissue evidence. But the trauma to the skull remained evident. So the time between the disappearance and discovery complicates identification of witnesses and leads, and it increases the chance that the perpetrator or perpetrators left no recoverable physical trace. And lastly, it's the vehicle found near home. So the illegally parked car near her apartment is pivotal. It's a pivotal early clue, and it raises questions about where she actually went that evening, whether she had a chance encounter near her building or whether someone lured or intercepted her nearer to home. Now that discrepancy with the car location versus the stated destination is repeatedly highlighted in police summaries and later investigations. And the investigators in 1969 to 1970, so they lacked the DNA and forensic tools that are available now in today's time, and decomposition further reduced the biological evidence. So witness recollection over time and the small window of active leads complicated immediate casework. So Baltimore County Police have treated the case as an active cold homicide and have periodically revisited it. And the case revolves, so really the case, it received press coverage at the time, and later investigative journalism and the 2017 Netflix documentary known as The Keepers. It brought renewed scrutiny, newly surfaced witness statements, and allegations that Cesnik's disappearance may be connected to the efforts to silence perceived knowledge that she had about abuse at Archbishop Keough High School. And documentary does not prove a definitive perpetrator for the murder, but it documents how the survivors and amateur investigators reopened the lines of inquiry. And in later decades, authorities and journalists pursued leads tied to other unsolved deaths and to alleged abusers. And some exhumations and DNA tests were attempted on persons of interest whose cases intersected with the Keough community. But those efforts have not produced a public, confirmed murder charge for Cesnik's killing. Investigations into related victims have also seen intermittent developments. Now, there are a few theories that have been circulated as well in this time about what really had happened. So, for one, people see it as a random attack versus targeted killing. Now, the blunt force trauma and the body concealment, they point to a violent homicide. Whether the attack was random or targeted, it remains debated. Investigative reporting since the 1990s has focused on the possibility that Cesnik's murder may be related to her awareness of sexual abuse within the school community, specifically allegations involving the school chaplain and others. But the murder itself has never been legally tied in court to a named individual based solely on that theory. And theories exist. They have not produced a criminal conviction. So really the theories that exist, they have not yet proved or have produced a criminal conviction. And it's a connection to the other unsolved killings. That's another theory. Because several young women's deaths or disappearances in the same time period in the region had suspicious elements. Investigators and journalists have at times explored whether the crimes were linked. Some forensic comparisons and renewed examinations have been attempted, but no definitive link that solved her murder has been publicly confirmed. Now, why does this portion of the story? So, why cover this specifically? Now, for one, it's the concrete, irrefutable core of the case. So, the dates, the vehicle location, the discovery site, and the medical finding are the backbone of every legitimate reconstruction. Those facts anchor all the responsible theorizing, and the timing created investigative vulnerabilities. The long gap before discovery and the decomposition directly reduced the investigators' ability to gather forensic evidence that could have pointed to the killer. That absence of immediate strong physical leads opened space for both reasonable avenues of inquiry and for rumor or speculation. And lastly, the discovery site and injuries frame motive questions. Now, the way and where the body was found, plus the blunt force cranial trauma, raise acute questions. Was this a targeted silencing, a sexually motivated homicide, or a violent robbery or assault that escalated? Now, those possibilities are what investigators and independent journalists have tried to parse. Now, what we really don't know and why this really matters is the complete forensic trail, because Cesnik's remains were badly decomposed, and there are limits to what forensic markers could be extracted in 1970. Newer techniques like DNA extraction from the bone comparison with known samples, it can sometimes overcome those limits. But access to potential reference samples and chain of custody issues make retrospective forensic closure difficult. And a publicly accountable suspect and legal resolution. Because despite many interviews, allegations, and investigative leads advanced publicly, there has not been a publicly litigated conviction tied to Cesnik's murder. That means the legal closure the family and the community deserve it remains unfulfilled. And then with the recent attention and the effect on the case. Now, the 2017 Netflix series, The Keepers, so it focused intense public attention on the murder and on the allegations of sexual abuse at the school where Cesnik had taught. And that renewed interest produced new witness testimony. It prompted the police to re examine the evidence, and it led to some investigative actions, such as DNA testing of remains associated with related cases. And while those efforts have produced additional documentation and public records, they have not produced a confirmed final legal resolution of Cesnik's homicide in the public record to date. Authorities, they continue to classify it as an act of cold homicide. And what we also have here is that we have the allegations of the abuse and the cover up. So when it comes to the allegations of abuse and the cover up, we look at the story of Catherine Cesnik's murder. So her murder in 1969 is one of Baltimore's most enduring and haunting mysteries. Now, while her disappearance and death initially baffled the investigators, the narrative took on an even darker dimensions decades later when former students of Archbishop Keough High School came forward with harrowing allegations of sexual abuse at the hands of Father A. Joseph Maskell, who was the school's chaplain. Now, these claims not only implicated Maskell, and this is Maskell right here, by the way. So, these claims not only implicated Maskell as a serial abuser, but also had suggested that Cesnik may have been murdered precisely because she knew too much and she intended to act on it. Now, in the early 1990s, more than 20 years after her death, there were two former students of Archbishop Keough, uh, known as Teresa Lancaster and Jean Wayner, who both stepped forward to file a lawsuit in 1994. So their courage was extraordinary, especially given the climate of silence surrounding the clerical abuse at the time. Now, when it comes to Jean Wayner's testimony, now she claimed that as a teenager, she had been repeatedly abused by Father Maskell, as well as other men that he had brought into the school, including the local police officers and the community figures. And Wayner had recalled that Maskell, he used his position of authority, his spiritual power, and psychological manipulation to coerce his victims into silence. And she even further claimed that in a twisted effort to normalize or rationalize the abuse, that Maskell would sometimes take students to Sister Cesnik's apartment under the guise of seeking help. And Wayner later alleged that Maskell once showed her Cesnik's lifeless body to intimidate her into silence, though this remains one of the most disputed and haunting claims. And then we have Teresa Lancaster's testimony. Now, Lancaster supported Wayner's accusations, providing her own detailed accounts of abuse by Maskell. Now, she described how he leveraged fear, shame, and threats of damnation to control students. And she also reinforced the idea that Cesnik had been aware of the abuse and that she had expressed compassion and concern for the students who confided in her. Now, in the 1994 lawsuit, it named Father Maskell the Archdiocese of Baltimore, Archbishop of Keough High School, and local gynecologist who allegedly participated in the abuse. However, though the case was ultimately dismissed, not because the court not because the court doubted the women's credibility, but because the statute, because the statute of limitations had expired. So the dismissal of Lancaster and Wayner's lawsuit highlights a broader systemic issue. See, for decades, survivors of clerical abuse were silenced not only by the psychological and spiritual manipulation of their abusers, but also by legal frameworks that failed to accommodate the realities of trauma. Survivors often require years, even decades, to process their experiences, to confront their abusers, and seek justice. And by the time that they did, the legal system had already closed its doors. Now, the Catholic Church, meanwhile, had a well documented pattern of protecting abusers rather than protecting children. In Baltimore and even beyond, allegations against the priests, they were often handled internally, with offending clergy quietly resigned to new parishes rather than investigated by law enforcement. Now, in this light, the claims made by Wayner and Lancaster gained further credibility, resonating with similar accounts emerging across the United States and later worldwide. Now, what makes these allegations particularly significant in relation to Catherine Cesnik's murder is the claim that she had been one of the very few adults who listened to the victims, because both Lancaster and Wayner insisted that Cesnik had taken their accounts very seriously and that she had planned to report Maskell to the authorities. Now, if this were true, then that means it would place Cesnik in direct conflict with powerful figures, with Maskell himself, who had the connections to law enforcement and the archdiocese. And then you had the institutional church, which had a vested interest in silencing the scandals. And on top of that, the complicit police officers and community members, if Wayner's claims of their involvement hold true. Now, in this scenario, Cesnik's murder, it ceases to appear as a random act of violence, and instead it becomes a targeted silencing of a whistleblower who stood up for vulnerable students. And then we also have the history of another man by the name of Edward Neal Magnus. Now, Father Edward Neal Magnus, particularly his association with Father Joseph Maskell, is a deeply troubling chapter in the history of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. See, now both individuals, they both have been implicated in numerous allegations of sexual abuse, casting a long shadow over the institutions that they were a part of. Now, Father Edward Neal Magnus, he served within the Archdiocese of Baltimore during the 1960s and 1970s. He held various positions, including assignments at the Cardinal Gibbons High School and Archbishop Keough High School. Now, his tenure at these institutions, they coincided with a period when numerous allegations of sexual abuse were reported against the clergy members. So Magnus, he was among the 156 priests that were identified by the Maryland Attorney General as having been accused of sexually abusing the minors during their time with the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Now, Father Joseph Maskell, uh, fellow priest in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, has also been the subject of the extensive allegations of sexual abuse. So, see, he served as a counselor at Archbishop Keough High School, where many of the reported incidents had occurred. And according to the Maryland Attorney General's report, Magnus and Maskell were often associated together in the abuse of the students. So, see, survivors have reported instances where Magnus was present during the abuse or actively participated in it. So, one such account details how Magnus directed a victim and two other girls to undress and photograph them on multiple occasions. And another survivor recounted an incident in 1970 when she was 14, where Magnus had allegedly gave her a drink believed to be drugged, and then he raped her in a police car while Maskell watched. So the Archdiocese reportedly settled with this victim in 2016. So the Archdiocese of Baltimore has faced significant scrutiny over its handling of abuse allegations involving Magnus and Maskell. Because in 2023, the Maryland Attorney General's report on child sexual abuse within the Archdiocese highlighted the extensive nature of the abuse and the systemic failures in addressing it. So see, the report identified 161 individuals as abusers within the Archdiocese, including both Magnus and Maskell. And it also detailed how church officials, how they often covered up the abuse, allowing the perpetrators to continue their activities unchecked. So, in response to the revelations, the Archdiocese has pledged to improve its policies and provide support to its survivors. However, though many critics they argue that these measures are insufficient and that more substantial actions are needed to address the harm to address the harm caused. Now, the cases of Father Edward Neal Magnus and Joseph Maskell underscore the broadened pattern of abuse and the institutional cover up within the Catholic Church. Now, you see, they serve as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities of minors in institutional settings and the responsibilities of institutions to protect them. And the failure to do so not only causes immeasurable harm to the victims, but also erodes the public trust in these institutions. Now, the allegations against Maskell reveal disturbing patterns, and those are psychological control. Survivors described how he framed abuse as therapy or spiritual guidance, exploiting his role as both a priest and a counselor. And you have intimidation. Now, the alleged showing of Cesnik's body to Gene Wayner, while impossible to verify, symbolizes the extreme psychological warfare employed to instill fear and compliance. And institutional silence, because the Archdiocese of Baltimore has consistently denied covering up the abuse. However, though, documents later revealed that the church had received complaints about Maskell during as early as the 1960s and 1970s. He was quietly removed from Keough in 1975, but he was still allowed to continue serving in ministry for years afterwards. reinforcing the suspicions of systemic cover up. And in the next part here, we have the investigations and the documentaries. Now, Kathy Cesnik, so once again, disappeared on November 7th in 1969. Body was found on January 3rd in 1970. So for decades, the killing remained officially unsolved, while there were a separate thread of allegations with the high school students that have been sexually abused by the school chaplain, by Maskell, has circulated in lawsuits, survivor testimony, and local reporting. And over time, the survivors' accounts and lawsuits alleged that Cesnik, once again, that she knew or had been told about the abuse, and that her inquiries into the students' welfare it placed her at risk. Now, these parallel narratives in unsolved murder and long suppressed abuse allegations, they lay largely dormant in the mainstream attention through the 1970s, through the 2000s, even as survivors and even some reporters they kept pushing for it. Now, Ryan White's 7-episode Netflix series, The Keepers, released in May 2017, reframed the Cesnik story in two linked ways. And the first way, it centered survivors' testimony, particularly the former Keough students who accused Maskell of prolonged sexual abuse and showed how those women's memories, allegations, and the social dynamics at the time were marginalized. And secondly, it tied Cesnik's murder narratively to those abuse allegations by presenting evidence, witness recollections, and patterns of institutional failure that suggested that Cesnik may have been targeted because she had begun to ask about the students' welfare. Now, the series, and also we have the documentary techniques that amplify the investigation and the trust in the survivors. Now, the series combines several documentary tactics that both humanize survivors and strengthen the investigatory thrust. Now, you had the extensive first person interviews, including detailed survivor memory narratives that were corroborated by other witnesses. You had the archival documents, you had the legal filings, the news clippings, and the audio. You also had the chronological reconstruction showing how the events around the late 1969 and early 1970 how they overlap. And you had the immersion into the grassroots research itself, but the former students are not distant subjects. They are investigators who crowdsource leads, they reopen old files, and they press institutions for records. And the immediate institutional and law enforcement responses after the series had aired. Now, the Netflix series arrived on the heels of some already active developments. In 2016, the Baltimore County Police had reassigned and reopened investigative attention to the case and obtained permissions to perform forensics and exhumations connected to the broader abuse allegations. So after the documentary's release, public pressure and media scrutiny increased. Investigative units revisited leads, interviewed additional witnesses, and executed forensic actions intended to use modern techniques that were not available in 1969 to 1970. Notably, the police they re-examined evidence and attempted the DNA comparisons. The exhumation of Maskell, who died in 2001, did not produce a DNA match that conclusively tied him to Cesnik's murder evidence, which was a complex and emotionally fraught result that does not legally exonerate him, but it removed one potential path to a solution. And then you had the renewed investigative energy extended beyond Cesnik to other unsolved murders and disappearances from the same era, and geography prompting exhumations and FBI involvement in select related cases. And then you had the limits. So there were limits of the documentary evidence versus the legal proof. So what the keepers, what they could and what they could not accomplish. Now, it's very important to stress this that documentaries are persuasive public histories. They're not trials. And the keepers, they dramatically clarify patterns and they raise new questions. But a documentary cannot, in and of itself, produce the standard of proof required for criminal conviction. The series, it compiled testimony, timelines, and documents that created a powerful narrative case for institutional wrongdoing and for the plausibility that Cesnik's inquiries into abuse put her in danger. But the documentary also left open ambiguities. And those ambiguities are the physical evidence linking a named perpetrator to the murder was not definitively produced on camera. And the DNA testing and forensic comparisons have been inconclusive or limited. And then you also had the statutes of limitations, the evidentiary degradation, lost records, and the deaths of key figures complicate the prosecutorial options. And institutional responsibility is also is also another one, which is like with the cover up, the concealment, the negligence is ethically and historically consequential, but proving criminal conspiracy across decades is procedurally difficult. And also, one of the documentary's most consequential effects was to center institutional accountability over lone actor explanations. The series made visible multiple institutional failures, and those failures, alleged failures by the archdiocese and religious orders to adequately investigate, report, or remove abusers, possible mishandling of student complaints by school administrators, and reported indifference or inaction by some law enforcement officials at the time. So, looking at the documentary, looking at it as a cultural and procedural precedent. Now, The Keepers is part of a larger trend in true crime documentary filmmaking, using long form narrative to recenter forgotten victims, to amplify survivor testimony and prod cold cases into active investigation. So, its template, survivor led inquiry, archival excavation, and institutional interrogation has really a tad broader effects, because the broader effects of this is that it encouraged other journalists and documentary teams to probe institutional failures. It showcased how public pressure, how it can influence the opening or reopening of official inquiries, and it raised ethical questions about the limits of storytelling, prompting a lot of debate about documentary responsibility and standards. Now what remains unresolved and what the investigators continue to pursue. Now, after the documentary came to an end and the immediate spate of renewed activity, there were several concrete problems that still remained. And those remain were that there were no publicly confirmed legal conviction tying a named suspect definitively to Cesnik's murder. Forensic evidence that either degraded or was never subject to modern methods at scale, limiting conclusive results. And you had the institutional records that are incomplete or protected by privilege, which restricts the public insight into administrative decisions made in 1969 through 1970. Now, the ethical and historiographical tensions that were raised by the series is so really, I would say that a thorough appraisal must acknowledge the important tensions. And these here are the important tensions. The first being the survivor empowerment versus the re traumatization. Amplifying survivor stories validates long silenced voices, but also reopens trauma. Ethical documentary practice demands survivor consents, care, and aftercare resources. Obligations, critics argue, are unevenly fulfilled in the genre. And then you have the narrative closure versus the factual uncertainty. Now, see, viewers often crave the tidy conclusions. Filmmakers must balance the narrative drive with the medical or legal limits of historical evidence. The Keepers, it leans into the moral certainty that institutional systems failed survivors, even while it admits uncertainty on the murder's final legal resolution, and its public justice versus due process. Naming suspects or implying connections in public media plays a role in accountability, but risks harming reputations if not tied to legal proof. And many outlets accompanying the series attempted careful language, but disputes about implication versus proof, they still persist. So the documentary's core achievement and what they did here was to return Cathy Cesnik, a vivacious teacher described by witnesses as devoted to students, to the center of the story, while connecting her death to a much larger institutional failure. And it helped shift the frame from an isolated cold case to a case entwined with decades long allegations of sexual abuse and systemic concealment. Practically, that shift produced renewed police action, forensic attention, and public pressure that moved institutions to respond in some form in investigation, settlement, and public statements. Substantively, it reopened the ethical, legal, and historical conversations about how powerful institutions and how they can shield abusers and silence victims. So, conversations that continue to shape how communities handle allegations today. And then we also talk about the legacy of Catherine Cesnik. So, Catherine Cesnik was a beloved teacher at Archbishop Keough High School, where she became aware of the sexual abuse allegations against Father Maskell, the school's chaplain. So her murder, occurring shortly after she reportedly planned to confront the church authorities about these abuses, has led many to believe that she was silenced to protect the institution's reputation. Despite the lack of conclusive resolution to her murder, her story ignited a movement for justice. And in the wake of revelations about Maskell's abuses, you had survivors like Teresa Lancaster and Jean Weiner that both came forward, sharing their harrowing experiences. So their courage in speaking out, despite the trauma and the institutional barriers, highlighted the urgent need for support and healing resources for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And this collective outcry, it led to the establishment of the Sister Cathy Cesnik Fund for survivors. Now, the mission of the fund itself. Now, the Sister Cathy Cesnik Fund for Survivors is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing financial assistance for the therapy and treatment of survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So, this was founded by the Keough alumni and other supporters. The funds the fund aims to alleviate the financial burdens that often prevent survivors from accessing the care that they need. By focusing on mental health support, the fund seeks to empower survivors, helping them reclaim their narratives and begin the healing process. So this operation it operates out of the Taneytown, Maryland, and the fund offers a range of services, including financial assistance for therapy sessions, support for treatment programs, and resources for connecting survivors with mental health professionals. And through these initiatives, the fund not only honors Sister Cathy's memory, but also provides a lifeline to those affected by the trauma of abuse. The story of Sister Cathy Cesnik and the subsequent establishment of the fund have had a profound impact on both local and national levels. And the documentary, The Keepers, it brought a lot of widespread attention to the case, shedding light on the systemic issues within the Catholic Church and the resilience of the survivors. And this increased visibility has led to renewed investigations into Maskell's actions and the church's handling of abuse allegations. And moreover, the fund has inspired other communities to establish similar initiatives, creating a network of support for survivors across the country. So, by focusing on healing and advocacy, these efforts contribute to a broader cultural shift towards accountability and support for survivors. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this video here today. So overall, Sister Catherine Cesnik's story is not just the account of a tragic death. It is a lens through which we all can examine the systemic failures, the moral courage, and the persistent struggle for justice within institutions, often shielded from scrutiny. Her life as a devoted educator and nun at Archbishop Keough High School in Baltimore was marked by genuine care for her students, an unwavering dedication to teaching, and an empathetic understanding of the struggles facing young women in a time when their voices were often silenced. Cesnik's disappearance in November 1969, followed by the discovery of her body 2 months later, revealed a horrific reality that even those who devoted their lives to faith and service were not immune to violence or the corruption of those in positions of power. The darkness surrounding her death exposes a complex intersection of abuse, institutional protectionism, and societal reluctance to confront the uncomfortable truths. Allegations later surfaced connecting her death to a knowledge of sexual abuse at Keough High School, suggesting that she may have been silenced because she threatened to expose the predatory behaviors of certain priests. And this connection underscores a fundamental tension between institutional preservation and moral accountability, a tension that persists in many organizations today, but it's particularly jarring within religious contexts that claim moral authority. Cesnik's story also reveals the profound challenges faced by whistleblowers and advocates for survivors of abuse. Even decades after her death, her case has been emblematic of how fear, intimidation, and systemic denial can hinder justice. Survivors' voices were historically marginalized, and investigative authorities were often slow to act or constrained by the institutional pressures. Yet, the efforts to seek justice, spurred by the journalists, the former students, and documentary filmmakers, illustrate the enduring power of persistence, courage, and collective action in challenging entrenched systems of abuse. Now, from my personal perspective, Cesnik's life and her death evoke a mixture of sorrow, admiration, and indignation because I find her story deeply resonant because it highlights the moral courage required to confront wrongdoing in environments designed to conceal it. And there is something profoundly inspiring about her dedication to her students, and yet deeply disturbing that her commitment may have contributed to the circumstances leading to her death. So, reflecting on her life, it forces me to consider the ways in which institutions can fail, not only those that they serve, but also the very individuals who dedicate themselves to service. And it raises a lot of questions about complicity, accountability, and our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Questions that are as relevant today as they were in 1969. So, moreover, her legacy is not solely one of tragedy. Her story continues to galvanize the efforts to bring accountability to the Catholic Church and other organizations that have historically operated with impunity. It encourages systemic reform, promotes awareness of sexual abuse, and provides a framework for survivor advocacy that emphasizes justice, transparency, and protection. So for me, her story serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable danger, moral conviction, and the desire to protect others can leave a lasting impact. So, in conclusion, the life and death of Sister Catherine Cesnik stand as a testament to the human capacity for both courage and cruelty. Her experience sheds light on the darker corners of institutional power, while simultaneously demonstrating the enduring importance of speaking truth to power, protecting survivors, and ensuring that the legacy of individuals like Cesnik continues to inspire meaningful change. Personally, reflecting on her story challenges me to confront the uncomfortable truths about systemic injustice, to value moral courage, and to consider how each of us might contribute, however incrementally, to creating a world where such tragedies are less likely to be repeated.